Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by the wandering investor himself, Ladislas Maurice. Ladislas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. How you doing, Robert?
Doing very well, thank you very much. We did just say off air we're in two completely different parts of the world, which is the joy of doing this. And there's plenty to talk about today. But before we get into that, for those that might not be familiar with yourself and the wandering investor, if you can, please do tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, share a little bit of background. So, bachelor's in business in Canada, then studied business and law at the University of Sydney in Australia. Started an expat career with Nestle, the big food company in Switzerland at their headquarters, and was then expatriated for 7 years. So, first 4 years to South Africa and then 3 years in Ghana. So in Ghana, my last role with the company was in charge of the dairy business for a few West African countries. I left at the age of 30, went traveling initially. I went on a big road trip from Oman to Paris because my parents were retiring at the same time as I left. So we went on a big road trip together. And I found myself in a situation where it was the first time that I had two things at the same time. One is time, because typically when you're young, you don't have a lot of time. And number two is money. And money is typically something you you also don't have when you're young. So I had both time and money. So I took my time, and then as we're traveling, I just saw these interesting opportunities. I'd go check out these real estate markets, etc., talk to people. We were in no rush, and then gradually I started doing flips and deals, and I never really got back to trying to look for a job. So now it's been almost 10 years of me traveling around the world with a focus on emerging and frontier markets, and I invest my own money. And I started a blog a few years ago, The Wandering Investor, and I document my journey.
That's fantastic. It's good to always speak to like-minded people that have been traveling, to say the least. I have to ask, is there been a particular favorite country that you've traveled through, and then one that might not be so good?
All right, so just from a pure travel point of view, I'm not saying go live there or, go invest there. Madagascar is absolutely unique. And nobody really ever discusses it. For most people, it's just a cartoon, but actually Madagascar is a very interesting island. There's unique flora and fauna, so I really recommend that. And countries that I find not too particularly interesting. I mean, all countries are interesting in their own way. I have a hard time saying that no country is interesting. There's always a learning to be had in any given country, even if you dislike it.
Fair enough. That's a good way to put it. Thanks for
If
sharing
you
that.
dislike it, if you really dislike a place, you're learning. You're learning about yourself. You're learning about things that you don't like. There's a lot of learning in being around places you dislike. Just make sure you don't stay around too much, but get the learning and, and leave.
Yeah, I think from a traveling perspective, that open-mindedness is important. I know from my experiences, there have been countries that I've preferred over than others for a multitude of reasons. And as you said, that learning curve is important. But I should say at the start, actually, the purpose of this podcast is to, number one, dispel a couple of myths out there, because we're in that stage now with everything that's going on in the world where things are getting more and more divided by the day, and people need those backup options. People need to start thinking about that. And I think there are these myths where, if I need a plan B or I need a different residency, these things cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I can't afford it, and you get all that negativity in. But the purpose of sitting down with yourself was to go through, some options out there, maybe some options that people haven't even thought about, and to say that, there are high ticket options, but there are also some less high ticket options. So before we go into that, I wanted to, because you've recently been in the UK, and I'm from the UK, and I know that things are a little bit tetchy over there. But you put a post on X that said along the lines of, You went to the pub with a couple of your friends, a typical, English tradition, but they were quite concerned to have an open conversation because of all of these, online laws and fiascos. So if you can, just a bit more on that, just so people have got an idea of what's going on over there.
Yeah, so we're just friends. We've known each other for like almost 18 years now. So we're, friends from a while back. We traveled a lot together. And one of them is actually South African, British South African. He was in South, I knew him from South Africa and even from before that when we were traveling, when I was backpacking in Asia. That's when I initially met him. And now he left South Africa. He lives in the UK. He's been living in the UK for 10 years, married, child at home, all of that. And we were at the pub and we were just catching up and discussing, the situation in the UK. And we're just, there weren't many people in the pub. We weren't particularly loud. And then he was really paranoid. He was looking around and he's like, mate, this is a conversation for home. And he was dead serious. And this is the
Wow.
sort of reaction I would expect in Egypt, that I would expect in Belarus, that I would expect in Vietnam. Those are not the sort of reactions I would expect from the UK, but the UK has and is sinking to that level.
Yeah, it's sad to see, and I was just saying off air that I've had conversations with friends and family back there, and views are mixed, but the overall consensus is that it's starting to disintegrate. It's almost like a competition to the bottom of France at the moment. I see their prime minister has resigned after less than a month, so a lot of turmoil. Um, I mean, that's one reason for this question, but why would people, no matter where you are in the world, listen to this? Why would people need to consider having a plan B in place? What reasons could pop up?
Look, a few. Look, if you're happy where you are and you think things are going to be fine, you don't need a plan B. If you're a bit tight on money, it might be a bit expensive to have a plan B. Ultimately, a plan B is a bit of a luxury, right? So I think let's start there.
Mm,
But objectively, if you look at the Western world, and here let's focus on Europe specifically. Let's Canada to some extent, Australia. The US is a bit different because there's always it's still like states are still fairly independent compared to the federal government. So even if the federal government is there's tyranny there, often at a state level, chances are it'll be a bit better. It's in Canada and Australia and in Europe, things are a lot more centralized. So if you're of the view that the situation is going to get worse in our countries in the West, whether that be from an economic point of view, whether that be from a social point of view, whether that be from a political point of view, and just generally from a safety point of view, um, it is far from crazy to have a plan B. Because when you actually need a plan B, then guess what? The doors will shut down. The doors will shut down.
mm,
And right now, it is still pretty easy as a Westerner to set up a very good plan B that doesn't require too much money and that does not require too much traveling and, too much going back and forth. It's still very, very much possible. So, people who are serious about a plan B should do it now. Anything could happen. You could end up in a situation where, look, and I'm not saying these situations are likely. Um, but I'm saying that they have a non-zero chance, right?
mhm.
How much likelihood you attribute to each of those is really ultimately entirely up to you. But I think they're non-zero. One is just a really, really bad economy, just a collapse of Western economies. Countries have gone through this in the past. In the West, we went through this in the 30s. Eastern Europe, they went through this in the 90s. These things happen. If you have a plan B, you have residency elsewhere, you can always move there and try to get a job and start a new business, etc. And economies, they're a bit healthier. Another reason would be politics, where gradually countries, enter tyranny, where you just can't speak up anymore, where you cannot raise your kids the way you want them, the way you want to raise them. I mean, I've been in situations where I say things to my kids, and then I'll be in a Western country and people are like, "Oh, you can't say this. What if they repeat it at school?" I
Mm.
mean, already it's like, so you're not gonna say what you really think to your children and what you have the, you're not gonna raise them the way you really want to raise them because people at school are gonna snitch on you with the, social services. Is that acceptable to you? Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Ultimately, that's a very personal discussion. Um, Personally, I don't want to have these restrictions. I just want to be able to raise my kids the way I want to raise them. And then also, safety. The West is not getting safer. I mean, you're from the UK. It's not getting safer. It's, it's not about to become safer either. As long as you have all these random people showing up on boats and the cops are too busy arresting people protesting genocide to instead of arresting people stabbing and stealing bikes. So at some point, a lot of people are gonna be like, I don't feel safe anymore. Is my 17-year-old, am I in an environment where my 17-year-old blonde blue-eyed daughter is safe going around, going out at night with her friends? Is this the environment I want my daughter to grow up in? I don't know. Ask yourself. Then there's also the risk of conflict. I
Mhm.
mean, especially in Western Europe, I mean, we're pretty belligerent. We're not trying to cut deals with Russia or with whomever. I mean, the US is just going on a rampage now. US is going on an absolute rampage. Is there going to be some payback at some point? Is the West going to be a target at some point? Maybe. If it is, I wouldn't want to be around. So, and then also just generational. A plan B is not necessarily just for yourself, it's also for your family, for your kids. Do you want to be able to hand them over a residency for later after you're long gone? Do you want your kids to have this possibility? Do you want your kids to have that other passport that opens really a world of opportunities? Sometimes these decisions can be generational, not just for you, but all your descendants. Some people here in the UK and some in your audience, some in the US, they're happy to have access to an Italian passport, an Irish passport. They're using it, they're happy. Maybe, maybe, your future generations will be happy that they have a Turkish passport or an African passport for business opportunities. Who knows? These things go down the generations. So I think, there's no, I'm not going to sit here and scream and be like, everyone needs a plan B. Like the West is dying, the dollar's going to crash. Like, look, we're all adults here. We all assess the situation the way we want to assess it. And then if you feel that, it would be wise to have, then act, do it.
I think that's very important that distinction that you've made that if you're happy where you are and you are in your own world and that's good enough for you, then great, super,
Yeah.
absolutely. All
Or
we
if you
can
want
do
to
is
fight,
record.
or
Hmm?
if you want to
Yeah.
stay and fight. And that honestly, I have more respect for.
Hmm.
If you're from the UK and like, I'm not leaving my country, this is my country, leaving means, or having a plan B means, just not having the courage to stay and fight for my country and fight for my traditions. I totally understand that. And that's actually more of a respectable approach than what I'm up to. But yeah,
Each to their own, I think, is how I would summarize that. And for those that, and again, we've got audience, the audiences worldwide. We've got all sorts of people, and I know there's all sorts of opportunities out there. So if we can, given your experience, let's start with the more low cost options. Again, I want to bust this myth that these things cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's not quite the case. But again, using your experience, Ladislas, what opportunities are out there that are relatively easily accessible and reasonably low priced at present?
yeah. So I'm assuming you want to leave the West in general.
Mhm.
Some of the easiest residencies and low cost, and that makes sense from a plan B perspective. So I'm not like sending you to Dubai, right? Because that's also a bit of an intense region. Um, it's just Latin America. Ultimately, this is when the European man is in trouble and needs to flee somewhere, he goes to the Americas. That's historically how it's happened,
Hmm.
and it still is.
Hmm.
So there are a few countries that allow you to get residency easily without having to spend much time on the ground to maintain it. And that's crucial. Because there are a lot of countries where you can get residency. A lot of countries in the world you can get residency actually. And often it's not that expensive. But the problem is to renew it, then they'll want to check, did you spend more than half the year in the country, more than 9 months in the country? If you haven't, they'll tell you, sorry, we're not renewing it. So effectively, you're just getting a plan B for like a year or two, which isn't helpful. So in Latin America, the top three countries really for Plan B residencies, because you don't have to spend too much time on the ground or barely any, Mexico, a country that you would tend to know relatively well, I think. Um, it's very easy to get residency in Mexico. You just need to demonstrate, either about $70,000 in your bank account for the past year or about $4,500 of monthly income for the past 6 months. Generally, it varies depending on from consulate to consulate, and Mexico's a bit ambiguous at times, but generally speaking, that's how it works. Or if you want to do what I did, is I made a Mexican. So with my wife, who's not Mexican, we flew to Mexico on tourist visas, and then she gave birth in Mexico, and this way, our all our kids are Mexican. They were all born in Mexico. They're all blonde, blue-eyed Mexicans, and we, as the parents, and then even our parents, the grandparents, we all received permanent residency. And when you have permanent residency in Mexico, you get it for life. You keep it for life. No need to spend time there to maintain it. So that's a great plan B. For Americans, it's a bit of a no-brainer. Just getting the residency, even the one where you show income, all that, that's temporary. But after 4 years, it turns into permanent, and you just need to make a few trips in between. So for Americans, Canadians, it's just like it's cheap to get to, it's easy, you can even drive. Like, I mean, it's just a great plan B. So that's one. A second one, that one's a bit farther away, is Paraguay. Essentially, you just need to show up with a Western passport, the right documents that you get home, and pay an agent a few $1,000s, and you will get residency. You'll get temporary residency initially. You'll need to make 2 or 3 trips, 3 trips in 2.5 years there to get to permanent residency. Once you have permanent residency, you just need to set foot there once every 3 years to keep it active. So this one is easy, cheap, but it's far. I mean, Paraguay is far.
Hmm.
And then there is the more luxurious option, Panama. And that one is, you either, as a Westerner, you either invest 200,000 in real estate, a 200,000 term deposit, or you create a local company and hire yourself, 3 trips in 2.5 years, and then once you have permanent residency, you can you just need to set foot there once every 2 years to keep it active. And Panama and Paraguay are territorial tax systems. So were you to move there and actually reside there full time and become tax residents there, you would just get taxed on your local sourced income. Any income sourced from outside of these countries would not be taxable. So effectively like tax havens. So, for 95% of people that want a serious plan B, one of the three will work out perfectly fine.
Thanks for diving into that. I'm very familiar with two of those three countries. I have traveled to all three in my lifetime. Panama's very interesting because Panama's got, my understanding is, as you've just alluded to, there's a lot of different options there. Again, I know that if you don't mind me referring back to an X post, and I'll link to this post in the post that comes with this podcast and video, is that you could also, as you said, what you've done or what someone done in your network is, I think it was put $200,000 into a Panama account, and then that's valid for, I think it was 3 years. And that also meant, because of the way their laws work, that everyone in the family got residency. So for clients and so forth, again, that's fantastic. If and again, we've got people listening to this that will undoubtedly have six or seven figures. That's quite a straightforward option. You just need to go through the paperwork and get that set up.
Yeah. And then after 3 years, you can take your money back, reinvest it, but you keep the permanent residency. So it's literally if you have 200,000 just sitting on a bank account, like just you shift it for 3 years and that's all you need to do. And then you're set for life.
Just amazing how simple that is. And again, that's the whole point of going through these processes and having yourself on. So,
And you know these plan Bs, they're for everyone. We have people from very different backgrounds getting plan Bs. So the first type of person I told you is just the typical Westerner, but we also have a lot of right now Chinese people that have Western citizenships that see the rising tension between China and the West, and they're like, well, I'm American, but like it says I was born in China. I look Chinese. I don't want to get Japanese in case, things get worse. I mean, I think we all remember how the Japanese were treated in the US during the Second World War. Um, and we also have a lot of Muslim clients that live in Western countries, in the UK, in Canada, and in the US, and they feel that they're increasingly hated and that they can't raise the way they want to raise their kids. So, they're like, well, I guess it's time to go. And they don't necessarily want to go to places like Dubai where objectively people often get treated like second class citizens, depending on, your ethnic background. Um, so we find them solutions in other, Muslim countries that are more appropriate for their values. So what's sad is that we are seeing it's like everyone is getting a plan B. A
mm.
lot of very different people are getting plan Bs, people from Western countries. Very different. And that's worrying. That's worrying.
No, it really is. And just to go back to what you said earlier on, and this is things that I write about as well, when you talk about the prospect of conflict and so forth. I sit here and I wish that does not happen at all. And I think most people, if not everyone, would agree you know, that it shouldn't happen. But history tells us, and given the direction of everything at the moment, history tells us that, as you said, it's not a zero chance that it's possible that it could happen. And if it did happen, then that might be a time where you wish that you'd have done something about it, which is the whole point of having this conversation.
Robert, I'll actually, let's be honest with ourselves here. We're saying non-zero chance if it happens. I mean, just look at Europe's history.
Hmm.
There will be conflict. There's always conflict in Europe. There's always conflict. Every 80 years we have like some major war going on. Um, have we become more reasonable since,
Probably not, no.
right? So
Somber note aside and truthful note aside, I know that going back to your work experience over with Nestle over in Ghana. There's also some interesting African opportunities. And again, these to me seem to be completely under the radar because a lot of focus is on, as you said, the Americas at the moment. But actually, Africa, very interesting continent in general. So what sort of things are available over there?
look, Africa is a continent. It is not a country. Which a lot of people tend to forget that. They just paint like Africa. But I mean, some of these jurisdictions are as different, if not more different than European countries from each other. So a lot of opportunities. Look, you go into some of these stock markets, and some of these companies have like a lot of moat. They're simple companies to understand, just like breweries and banks and um, you know, distributors and supermarkets and whatever. And they're trading at P ratios of like 6, 7, dividend yields of 8, 9%. They barely have any debt on their balance sheets. They're growing double digit every year. Again, they have moat. The population is growing. So sure, there's volatility in these markets. But in terms of diversification, in a world that has gone very crazy in many respects, where there's just funny money everywhere.
Mm.
Africa hasn't really been impacted by funny money at all. So you can find these essentially kind of value stocks, but they're not really value stocks because we all know the negative connotations that come with like a value stock. They're just good businesses that are well priced and that pay decent dividends and then have good growth prospects. So you can find a lot of those across the continent. And then also real estate is interesting. So as a real estate investor, I probably invested like 40% stocks, 40% real estate. Um, I am increasingly investing in Africa. Why? I like the demographics, right? When I travel around Europe, look, I love Europe, but it's just old people everywhere. And when I look at the youth, the quality of the youth is just not as high as the quality of the youth that we had like a generation ago or two generations ago due to immigration. Um, so, at the end of the day, do you run a first world country with third world labor? Can you? Especially when the third world labor gets your citizenship and can vote.
Mm.
And typically they don't vote that great. So, it's not very promising. I'd rather actually go straight to the third world countries and buy assets that are priced the way they should be priced. Um, so like right now I'm investing quite heavily in Kenya in real estate. And all these countries have their issues. They're volatile, and you're going to see headlines of coups and attempted coups and social issues and protests and the odd currency crash and capital controls and this and that. But ultimately, I am investing in countries that have a lot of natural resources, that have good demographics as opposed to the rest of the world, which is now just in complete demographic decline. Even South Asia I mean, the fertility rate is below replacement in many cases. So I think it's actually unreasonable to not have exposure to Africa at this point because it is so different on so many metrics. And it's in between in a world that is increasingly divided between East and West. Africa has been pretty good at being in between and playing both sides, which I think especially from a commodities point of view, is interesting. Is very interesting. Everyone has access to African commodities, whether it's the Chinese or the West, etc. So, who knows? Maybe down the line we'll see bidding wars for African assets. So I think it would be unreasonable to not have some exposure to Africa. Obviously, I'm not telling you to go overweight Africa,
Mhm.
but people should start to get comfortable with the idea of gradually investing in Africa and starting to understand Africa a bit better and, maybe just go on a trip. People are so biased against Africa. Like the very same people that will say stuff like, "Oh, you're critical of immigration from Africa, blah 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 blah," and then they'll be like, "What? Invest in Africa? That's crazy." Blah. It's just, it's like, yeah, yeah, sure, I'm critical of mass immigration that isn't curated, and yes, I invest in Africa, and yes, Africa is amazing. I had some of my best years in Africa. I spent most of my 20s in Africa. I love spending time on the continent. I'm flying back there in a few weeks, actually, in 3 weeks. I'm flying to Sierra Leone for 2 weeks and then Kenya. So people just need to travel and understand the world a little bit more.
I definitely agree with that. Definitely get out there and experience everything. I can't say I've ever been to Africa myself, actually. So I'm just trying to send some questions over from a mentality of I've never been, but I imagine it's an interesting place to explore. You mentioned it early on, actually, to be fair, things like social issues, political issues, not crime as such, but what's the word I'm looking for? Corruption, those sorts of things. I know South Africa's in the news quite a lot. But again, from your experience, what sort of countries, dispel a couple of myths if you can, but are there any countries that maybe from a political point of view are more stable than others? What do you think? What's your experiences?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I'd like to frame this conversation a bit differently. It's like, yes, there's political instability and social issues and all of that, but it's priced accordingly. And things are getting better gradually. Like I can tell you, I see a difference whenever I go back to Africa. Things like the youth is becoming ever more educated and things are improving. The fundamentals are getting better in most jurisdictions, not all. Some are just, to forget about it. But I'd say is the discrepancy in valuations between first world and Africa still worth it? Should it be that big? Right? When I look at places like the UK, I mean, first world jurisdiction, really? Is it really a first world jurisdiction now? When you see the total clowns that are running your government
Hmm.
and the circus that your judiciary is turning into, and the unseriousness of it all, and the deep socialism you're falling into, and the debt you're addicted to, I think it's more than making the case for Africa. What I'm disputing is the gap in valuations. And that gap in valuations is telling me have some exposure to Africa because it's we are turning into emerging markets in the world, in the Western world, but we're not priced that way. People haven't yet realized that they're living in future developing countries, but that's what we're turning into. So to
100%,
answer your
100%.
question, yes, some countries are better than others and more safe. And I'll say this and then I'll name a country now and I can tell you within 6 months there'll be an attempted coup. Um, Ivory Coast is a good one on the Francophone side of things, but also, prone to political issues. They had a civil war 20 years ago. Senegal is not bad. Ghana has its up and downs, but is generally speaking pretty stable, though it's a complete yo-yo with their currency. Kenya is interesting, though they have some deep-rooted social issues. Tanzania is not bad, but like, gosh, the productivity level there is pretty low. Um, Uganda has political issues, but economically it's still doing fine. Rwanda, people like to talk about Rwanda, saying that it's very stable politically, but that's also, a bit much sometimes. Um, yeah, yeah, there's like a whole bunch of countries, and then there are other countries that are very stable, like Namibia. Namibia is very stable. Botswana has been stable, but now they're kind of running into issues with all their diamonds and synthetic diamonds and the diamond market doing terrible. So let's see how that goes on. Countries that are surprisingly stable instead of having nothing is like little countries like Malawi. Like there's a lot going on. It is a complex continent, extremely diverse, and full of opportunities. If you really want to make money, you go there and you do business yourself. But then that's like, operational complexity on another level.
I'm sure there'll be people listening to this. Again,
And
we've got people from all sorts of
and
backgrounds. You never know.
again, you talk corruption. It's like, oh yeah, it's corrupt. All right, so sure, someone from the electricity company will come like shake me down and say if I don't pay this, they'll cut the electricity to my business. Okay, sure. They want $100, sure. Um, I mean, in the UK, it's insane. It's, you'll be paying insane corporate taxes, income taxes. You'll get no social services. Um, you'll get dragged into court over nothing. So and there's still corruption just at a higher level. So yeah, there's corruption, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do business there. And sometimes street level corruption is less of an issue than government oppression.
I appreciate the way you frame that. I really do. It's helping me to reframe things in my head as well. No, thank you for that. I've got a lot to go away and think about myself on an individual level. Just trying to link in, and again, you've spoken about Plan B options in the Americas. So I just want to try and link some Plan B options in Africa as well while we're at it. So, what sort of options are available? Are there things such as putting X amount into an account or buying some real estate? And yeah, what sorts of things on those levels are available at the moment?
There's not much of a market for residency by investment, like official residency by investment in Africa, apart from Egypt. But that's not, I don't think that's the Africa you're referring to. Gambia has some schemes, Sierra Leone as well, Namibia. Generally speaking, in most African markets, you create a company, you hire yourself, you're in, generally speaking. Um, so that works. What we do offer, though, and we're licensed agents for these directly with the governments, is we offer citizenship by investment in a few African countries. So if you want to become a citizen of Sao Tome, a little island between Central and West Africa in the Gulf of Guinea, that'll set you back $95,000 or $100,000 all in for a family of four. And that citizenship just goes down the generations. And another one is Sierra Leone in West Africa. That one is particularly interesting. A bit more expensive, $140,000 for the main applicant and then 10,000 for each dependent. But you can also change your name if you want. If you have some African ancestry that you can prove through your DNA test, then it's 100,000, not 140,000. And that one's particularly interesting because it gives you access to ECOWAS. What is ECOWAS? ECOWAS is essentially the European Union of West Africa. So by getting the citizenship of Sierra Leone, and we have clients that are getting this passport as part of their legacy planning, um, family offices, etc. Because by being a citizen of Sierra Leone, you can then very easily move to countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Senegal. We're talking ECOWAS, 400 million people, and some of the fastest growing markets in the world and highest demographics in the world as well. So by doing this, you're giving access not just to yourself, but most importantly to your children and your future descendants to be able to do business in Africa, essentially as a local.
Fantastic. So definitely opportunities out there. And again, this is the whole point of having yourself on is to go through and explain that these opportunities do exist. Before we wrap up with, so I want to go back to Latin America for one reason. I'll get into that in a minute. So we've covered the Americas in general. We've obviously looked at Europe at present. Africa we've just touched upon. Uh, is there anything else around the maybe in Asia or anything like that? Is there anything else out there that's relatively attractive at the moment, or is it mainly Latin America and Africa?
Look, in Asia, you have some countries that are quite interesting, like Malaysia. We send a lot of Australians there, Europeans, Americans, not so much, Muslims from the West to Malaysia because it's very safe. It has a territorial tax system, so also you get taxed on your local income, not on international income. So if you're trading stocks, doing whatever, no taxes, no taxes. And it has a decent network of double tax treaty agreements, so you can still benefit from that for your dividends and the like. And that one's pretty good. You need to invest, generally speaking, at least $250,000 to get it. And Malaysia is very calm, peaceful, very respectful of all religions, though it's a Muslim country, there are a lot of Christian churches, etc. So, everyone can feel at home in Malaysia. The only drawback with Asia is that it will never lead to a permanent residency of sorts. It will never lead to citizenship, right? So, and that's one of the great things as a Westerner about Latin America is that it will lead to citizenship. If you play your cards right and you actually live in these countries, eventually you will be able to get citizenship. And that is just the ultimate form of sovereign diversification is having another citizenship. Because we're seeing it right now. I have Ukrainian clients. They were lucky enough to not be in Ukraine when the war started, or they were lucky enough to pay early on to get out of Ukraine when the war started. But now they can't renew their passports anymore. If they go to a Ukrainian consulate and they say, I need to renew my passport, they say, sorry. got to go back to Ukraine for that. And then when they get to Ukraine, boom, they get drafted. So if their passports expire, they're stuck where they are. If they lose their passports, they're stuck where they are. If the passports run out of pages, they're stuck
Mm.
where they are. So clients like that need a second passport to be able to still travel, even if it's just some African passport on which they have to ask for visas. So, we increasingly have clients that want that. They just want a passport, any passport, because they think war is coming. And they want to make sure that, sure, they'll have a residency, but they want to make sure that, they have another passport in case they just can't function with that passport anymore because it doesn't get renewed anymore.
Going back to Latin America, and we'll finish off here because I know that you've been working very hard in the background to put on something for March 2026, and that's down in Argentina. So the floor is all yours, Ladislas. Do
Yeah.
tell everyone about that and what it involves and how they can get in touch with you about that.
Yeah, so yeah, we're selling way faster than our projections. So we're organizing a 4-day event in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and it is a really on the boots on the ground event. So 4 days, 2 days we'll be meeting with local experts, professors, economists, Milei party members to really understand what's happening in the Argentinian economy. We'll be meeting with venture capital as well, private equity. We also have some of Argentina's largest listed companies, some of which have ADRs in New York that will host us at their headquarters, present to us their businesses, and we'll get to ask them how's your business impacted by all the reforms? How do you handle inflation? How do you handle projections in such an environment? So we'll be able to ask all of these questions to some of the country's largest companies. So that'll be fascinating. And then we'll also have 2 days of looking at real estate, and not just being dragged around by some developer to show off his new projects, but really secondary market as well, primarily. Just checking out the range of options that there are for investing. Because at this stage, if the reforms continue in Argentina, real estate is in a bull market right now in Argentina. It started a year and a half ago. It's in a bull market. If the reforms continue, it'll continue going. And in many respects, Argentina is a very counter-cyclical play. Even from a stock point of view, they've almost reverted back to when Milei was initially voted in, right? But the reform is still ongoing.
Mm.
So is there a play there? So I think that's what we're going to be focusing on. So 4 days on the ground, and then every night, great dinners and steak and wine and all that, and good company. We have people coming from a lot of Americans, Canadians, Europeans, a few Australians, people coming from New Zealand, Hong Kong, Vietnam. Very diverse crowd. So it'll be a lot of fun.
Well, I'll put a link to that on the notes that come with this, and I believe that's between March the 15th and March the 15th and 19th, I think, in
Correct.
2026. Perfect. I'll put a link to that in the show notes that comes with this, so people can reach out and have a look at it for themselves. It's been a sobering and thoroughly enjoyable conversation at the same time. Thank you for helping me reframe a couple of things as well. But before we sign off, is there anything we haven't discussed yet that you would like to discuss at all, or are you happy that you've covered the key countries that are in your head?
Look, I think we're entering a moment in history where it's important to be diversified. Because if we look at how insane the world has been in the past 5 years, I don't think that there will be any less insanity in the next 5 years than anything's possible. And the way to get through this, especially if you have a fair amount of assets, is to be diversified. And that means not just diversified financially, but also on the personal front with, residencies and citizenships and all that. Just stay flexible, stay diversified, and try not to become greedy.
Solid advice there. Thank you for that. In terms of people getting in touch with you, again, I'll link to all of this in the notes. So I've got the wanderinginvestor.com, obviously newsletters, the Notes from the Road newsletter as well. And then on X, Wander, WANDER_investor. Are they the best ways for people to get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, perfect. Well, Ladislas, I really enjoyed that. I look forward to catching up at some point next year, maybe after the Argentinian conference, and just to see what the lay of the land is.
Sounds good. Thank you, Robert.